So I just want to introduce Mara Mills from New York University. Thank you very much for coming.
Thanks.
And she had to attend a very late invitation, so thank you for it.
I'm so glad it worked out. Yes, it was lucky it worked out. I unfortunately have to leave Thursday night on an overnight flight to go back for something I'm running on Friday, but otherwise this last-minute invitation worked out really well, and I'm so happy to be here. So thank you, Fernando, and all the other organizers. Jonathan Stern sends his greetings to everyone. He says that he wishes he could be here today. He's looking forward to the next iteration of the conference when he hopes he can come. And it was just lucky I could fill in, because my talk today is an outtake from the book that Jonathan and I are co-authoring right now on the history of time stretching and pitch shifting technology. And that book is tentatively titled Tuning Time, Histories of Sound and Speed. Jonathan and I had a fellowship at the Max Planck Institute for the History of Science about a year and a half ago, where we wrote 3 chapters of the book. I wrote 1 chapter, and I'm going to talk from that chapter today. He wrote 1, and then we co-authored 1. And this summer, we'll be back together in Berlin, hopefully, and we will keep working on the book together. It'll be a couple of years before it comes out. So our aim in the history that we are telling of time stretching is to foreground the contributions of forgotten actors to the history of this audio editing technique, shifting the focus from the engineers who are credited in the patent and commercial and industrial records to their test subjects, or to consumer demand, or also to tinkerers who created speculative and now forgotten prototypes for time stretchers and pitch shifters. All of my research beyond the project I'm doing with Jonathan takes place at the intersection of disability studies and technology studies. I'm a professor of media studies at New York University, and I also co-founded and co-direct the Center for Disability Studies there. And how those 2 fields come together will be more obvious to you after you hear my talk. Today, I'm going to describe the hidden labor of the blind test subjects who helped bring the first time-stretching hardware into being. Before it was a software technique, it was a hardware technique in the 1970s. Regarding the conference theme of I/O, input-output, self-other, inside-outside, I will consider the ways that others, in this case disabled people, seem at once to be outside mainstream technological systems and at the same time provide input for their design. Scottish design theorist Graham Pullen has argued that disabled people and assistive technology are popularly imagined to be beneficiaries of mainstream technology, which merely trickles down to them through charity. In all of my work, I have attempted to reverse this narrative and to show that engineers and industry just as often appropriate ideas, labor, and social capital, like public relations, PR, from the disability community. This particular reversal, however, does not necessarily speak to the decolonial concerns that animate much of this conference, or it doesn't have to intersect, but I want to raise the question of how disability theory and decolonial theory might intersect as we open the conference. Last year, I published a roundtable on decolonial computing in the online journal Catalyst, Feminism, Theory, Technoscience, which some of you know, with my colleague at NYU, Paula Chakravarti. We argued that a common approach for scholars working at the intersection of decolonial theory and science and technology studies has been to examine the legacies of colonial ideology within engineered objects, scientific categories, or medical protocols. So the way these artifacts incorporate and then prescribe particular values and uses. Beyond invention and design, we noted that decolonial analyses can be applied at every stage of the global computing supply chain: physical resource extraction, information extraction in the emerging paradigm of data colonialism, low-wage electronics manufacture and digital labor, pirate assembly, peripheral digital practices, e-waste, pollution, environmental justice. Yet all of these approaches run the risk of maintaining or emulating unidirectional models of technological progress, wherein, and here I want to quote feminist scholars Banu Subramaniam and Anne Pollock, science, rationality, progress, and enlightenment always rest in Europe and the West to subsequently diffuse to non-Western nations. So again, I want to leave this as a question. Thank you. Thank you to the translators for your patience with me. I'm going to talk, actually, this is very perfect timing here, because in the middle of my talk, I'm going to give you an anecdote about blind readers norming and monitoring the speech pace of narrators for records before time stretching was available. And here you see that this is a practice that still has to happen, especially with translation, also with sign language translation, which I have in a lot of my talks. So yeah, I just, in this little preface I'm giving to you, I want to leave this as a question with which to open this conference. When we write about sound technology, as opposed to sound production or listening techniques, what are the possibilities for a decolonial approach? And what possibilities are opened up by the alterity work of disability studies, which is the theme of my talk, but it's in a US frame? And how might the defamiliarization of technical equipment and history from Anglophone disability studies be placed in a broader global frame? Okay, so on to time stretching. I'm going to begin with a story set in an institution for disabled people, which used to be very common in the United States. Most of these are being closed down now. In 1944, at the Wisconsin School for the Blind in Janesville, Wisconsin, a middle school student named Harvey Lauer and a group of his friends returned to the boys' dormitory after history class, scheming about ways to speed through their night's reading homework. Their teacher had assigned them several chapters in a talking book. This is a precursor to audiobooks. The talking book was called Ivanhoe, and it was supposed to be an entertaining supplement to their Braille textbook. But of course, they didn't want to do their homework. Talking books on phonograph discs allowed the students to read together as a group, rather than alone. And they were faster to get through than Braille reading. But the boys were certain that they could hasten the task even further to minimize their homework time. Before moving to this institution, Harvey lived with his extended family in Milwaukee. He remembers his grandmother having a mechanical record player from the early 1920s with a turntable powered by a hand-wound spring and a sliding lever, somewhat like this one, by which the listener could continuously vary the speed up to 100 revolutions per minute. Talking books became available in 1932, around the time Harvey was born, thanks to electrical recording and long-playing records. Now, when he began reading talking books a few years later, their playback machines, like most of the new electrical record players, didn't have variable speed control anymore. They had synchronous electrical motors and only 2 or 3 options for turntable speed, something like either of these. Only in 1950 would mass-marketed American record players offer variable control for turntables again, much to the disappointment of blind talking book readers and other audiophiles who liked that control. In the case of the first talking books, the rate was fixed at 33 1/3. So Harvey always played his books on his grandmother's old phonograph player instead. The narrator's voice increased in pitch the faster he let the spring unwind. Pressing his ear against the horn to hear the soft sounds, he could just barely make out the words at double the speed. And this is how he liked to read. This was his blind, oral, high-speed reading practice. In the field of sound studies, experiments with the playback speed of turntables are taken to be defining acts at the origin of electronic music and sound art. Undoing the reputation of the phonograph as a medium of faithful reproduction, its affordance for variable speed was instead used to distort the pitch of recordings and make new sounds. The most iconic example is perhaps the gramophone music concert performed by composers Paul Hindemith and Ernst Toch in Berlin in June 1930. Hindemith tweaked the playback rate of 3 discs with recorded vocals and instruments, xylophone and cello, calling these trick recordings. A teenaged John Cage was in the audience. 9 years later, he composed his first electroacoustic piece, Imaginary Landscape No. 1, for piano, cymbal, 2 turntables, and a few Victor tone records, which were otherwise used to calibrate instruments or test room acoustics. And this piece depended upon him changing the speed, using variable speed to change the tone of those, to change the pitch of those tone records. I'll play you a little clip from that, which is probably familiar to many of you. So changing speed. This set of experiments, music scholar Mark Katz writes, prefigure turntablism, electronic synthesis, and remixing. Now, speed, except for these anecdotes, I would say speed has been relatively ignored in sound studies. It hardly appears beyond these cases in either academic or popular survey texts on sound recording and editing. I've pulled these 2 book covers as just 2 examples. And this is particularly surprising given the emphasis on temporality in neighboring fields, for instance, cinema studies and its obsession with things like frame rate. Only very recently have historians of sound begun to look for other scenes of variable speed in the first half of the 20th century, looking finally beyond the musical elite, before magnetic tape and convenient editing tools became widely available. So Emily Thompson, for one, is researching the phonographic experiments of anonymous motion picture projectionists in the early years of film sound and the ways they manipulated speed. Julia Kursel and Carmel Raz have written on the adjustment of playback speed by European phoneticians who wanted to transform the pitch of vowel recordings for linguistic research. The oral, AURAL, speed reading techniques of talking book readers, the theme of this talk, often required an impressive amount of lay technical expertise, and they similarly broaden the context of temporal manipulation for early recorded sound. Okay, so at the Wisconsin school, Harvey recalls asking his teacher if he could borrow an older phonograph player to read his school books at high speed rather than use the electrical ones, but his teacher said no. So he and the other boys, hoping to skim their books, decided, as he put it when I interviewed him, to jimmy, or this is an old-fashioned English word for hack, their fixed speed machine. They wrapped tape around the motor shaft to increase its circumference and thus drive the turntable faster. They wasted some time coming to a consensus about just how fast they all could read. Negotiations aside, the boys read together at high speed for several weeks, and then the record player broke, and they got in a lot of trouble. Its bearings were ruined by the vibrations caused by the tape. When Harvey went to college and became active in the National Federation of the Blind, the NFB, which is one of the more radical activist blind groups in the US, he learned that these sorts of hacks had been taking place at state institutions all across the United States, where blind students universally longed for the return of variable speed turntables. Although at this point, it didn't yet occur to anyone that a machine might be built to allow sped-up playback without the chipmunk effect on pitch. I'm sure many of you in this room have played with the speeds of tape players or records, but just in case, I'll play you a demo of this chipmunk speech, produced in the 1970s by a company called Variable Speed Control, which was trying to solve this problem. This was one of the early companies making time-stretching hardware.
Congratulations, you have just turned on a tape recorder. Except this tape recorder is a little bit different. You see, built into this cassette device is something called variable speech control. On your machine is a dial that will actually allow you to adjust my rate of speech to make it as fast as your ears will allow you to listen without that annoying chipmunk effect.
Without that annoying chipmunk effect that you usually get when you listen to a speeded up tape.
Without...
So I got that tape from Harvey, as I'll explain in a moment. Decades later, in the early 1970s, Harvey became one of the test subjects for the so-called VeriSpeech time compression device designed by Francis Lee, an engineering professor at MIT, who he met at a conference for instructors of the blind in Florida. Harvey was by then the technology transfer specialist for the Veterans Administration outside Chicago, and he volunteered himself and a number of his students who were blinded war veterans after hearing Lee's presentation about a new electronic tape player that converted recorded sound into a stored signal, which could then be sampled at a rate determined by the user with a tiny 0.06 seconds of speech pulled out and discarded with each sample so that the tape could be sped up without any change in pitch or loss of intelligibility. And I'll show you what this first time-stretching device sounded like. It's Francis Lee's voice, and this is a demo tape that he gave to the blind students. So this, I digitized it, but the tape is from the 70s.
The speech vector of the following segment is 2. The playback time is reduced to 1/2 of the original.
I'm opening to the world's most populous nation. In 2 weeks, I shall begin my journey for peace to begin. The agreement to meet and the mutual trust needed to make the arrangements for the first American state visit to the People's Republic of China.
Okay, so early time stretching. That was Lee introducing Richard Nixon, both of them sped up. I want to point out before I go on with this a little bit, just how unusual, the canonical story of time stretching is only about these engineers. It's only about people from MIT and rarely about the test subjects or the consumer demand that preceded them. And even if it is about consumer demand, it's almost never said in institutions for disabled people. I mean, in technology studies, people who are institutionalized are not thought to be tinkerers or technological experts in any way. So when I started interviewing Harvey, I knew that he had worked for the VA, but I didn't realize that as a child he had been institutionalized. And it even surprised me, with all of my experience in disability studies, to hear his narratives about the creativity and the technical expertise happening in these asylums. So Francis Lee's VeriSpeech device was patented in 1972. And it's known now as the most successful of a set of early time-stretching devices from the 70s. It could be used for either time compression, which is speeding up, and that's what you heard, or time expansion, slowing down, which, as you know, would otherwise turn recorded speech into like a very low-pitched growl. Lee's company Lexicon went on to become a leader in the field of high-end audio. They won their first Emmy in 1984 for their time-stretching technology. They've won a ton of technical Grammys in the 2000s. The company still exists. It turns out that the Verispeech also had a setting that allowed one to adjust the pitch of the recording without changing the length of the playback time. In other words, the reverse process from time stretching. And for this reason, it's known as the first commercial pitch shifter, preceding auto-tune by 20 years. Like pitch shifting, time stretching techniques were quickly taken up by the radio and television industries and by musicians and DJs and film sound designers. I'm guessing many of you know that time stretching is a standard feature in audio recording and editing software now. These are just screenshots of, you can barely read them, but the time stretching or time shifting parts of the menu for the Digirac plugin for Pro Tools, the Logic Pro interface. This is very, very common. So in the remainder of my talk, I'm going to tell you what happened in the 40 years between the advent of talking book recordings in 1930 and oral speed listening and the creation of tools in the 70s for rate change without change in pitch, time stretching. So this talk is basically an archaeology of this drop-down menu item, and an otherwise abstract and seemingly ahistorical digital tool used by sound artists and engineers all over the world. I'll start by briefly discussing the rationale for talking books and their initial acoustic design, and I'll play some sound files for you. I'll talk about the strategies that were employed for converting printed text and images into speech and sound. The first collections of talking books were recorded at studios in New York and Louisville, Kentucky, and they employed experimental sound effects and theatrical narration. The second part of the talk considers the dissatisfied response of a subset of readers, blind university students and blind employees in reading-intensive environments, who agitated for totally plain, standardized narration and unembellished recordings to facilitate the playback of records at high speed. Later, they began agitating for ways to speed things up without pitch shift. At stake was not simply the conversion of print from one format to another, from ink to sound, but also the conversion of behavior from one sensory mode to another. These readers transferred certain print habits shared between visual ink print and tactile embossed print to the medium of recorded speech, especially those habits associated with what's called extensive reading, speed reading, skimming, skipping ahead. So phonography seems to fix sound, turning it into a persistent physical artifact. But as Patrick Feaster has pointed out, sound recordings must be educed to be experienced. And in that process, of output transduction, a sound recording is converted from a spatial object back to a kinetic, temporal one. So if you're reading by ear, how do you treat an ephemeral sound wave as a page? How do you navigate on that sonic page or speed through several sonic pages without changing the sound itself? Oral speed reading is something distinct from simply listening to words at high speed. To read entails a measure of control, scanning, skipping, searching, that doesn't take place, for instance, in just listening to words in conversation, or listening to me talk. Nor is oral speed reading as a technique identical to listening to any kind of high-speed sound. Nonverbal sounds that don't require decoding, can often be sped up without distortion. Some categories of noise can be sped up with no change at all, or no apparent change. So this piece of research is also a contribution to the growing taxonomy of listening techniques in sound studies. Far from the stereotype that Jonathan Stern has enumerated in his first book of listening as passive and immersive, we're beginning to understand the histories of directive listening, diagnostic listening, sequential and mobility listening, auditory memory, auditory accommodation, environmental sound interpretation. I could go on and on. These are just themes from recent publications. See, for instance, the work of Karin Beisterveld's group on sonic skills. They've published a ton of articles and books on sonic skills and listening techniques. Oral speed reading, the theme of this lecture, is a very recent listening technique. It's not essential. It's not innate. It came about as a result of compulsory literacy, a requirement to read, and it was also afforded by phonography, which played speech back at a rate beyond that which any fast-talking human could produce. Playing speech back at these high speeds wasn't possible. Hearing speech at these high speeds wasn't possible before the phonograph. Oral speed reading represents one among many listening techniques that I have found in my research were explicitly theorized and sometimes invented, taught, and disseminated from blind schools starting in the 1930s. And I've only researched blind schools in the US, the UK, and Germany so far, but I'm assuming this is probably true elsewhere. I've collected a number of examples of listening curricula as part of the research for this book project with Jonathan. This pamphlet is just one example. And I use it to say that ways of listening don't just originate and disseminate from centers of power. I love this book because each page has examples of kinds of listening that were taught to blind children. Sequential listening, tactual and sound discrimination, where one listens and touches at the same time, mobility listening, following travel directions, and they also talk about oral speed reading. And oral speed reading, of course, I'm arguing in this paper, is a modern listening technique that disseminated from blind readers and had this massive impact on listening more broadly because of time-stretching technology today. So it may be a truism in the history of technology that artifacts are consciously or unconsciously materialized or reified theories. This is Bachelard, or reified ideologies, Langdon Winner, materialized techniques or behaviors, Madeline Ackrich, or materialized human factors, Jonder and Peters. But we still have comparatively few case studies demonstrating how this process of the materialization of technique into technology occurs. Oral speed reading, I hope to show you, not only created a market and a social pull, to use a rhetoric from innovation studies, but rather the hacking and knowledge production of the purported test subjects and early adopters of commercial time-stretching technology actually precedes the so-called invention of the technology itself. Whereas the variable speed experiments of contemporary 1930s film projectionists and musicians like Cage aimed for the overall distortion of sound recordings. That was the goal of that kind of speed up. Oral speed reading aspired to uncouple time and pitch, and this is key, to distort a talking book in time without it sounding distorted in frequency. And it's that technique, not the John Cage just pure distortion technique, that underpins and in fact propelled the controlled manipulation of the speed of sound today for the purpose of either obvious or imperceptible distortion. From auto-tune for pitch correction, to vocal special effects, to dubbing, to tempo matching for musical mashups, to time stretching to fit movies into established broadcasting windows, to all the other uses we have for time stretching today. Okay, so, let me go back. This will stay with him. So to explain where this demand for oral speed reading and uncoupling the time and pitch of sound came from. Robert Irwin, who was the blind director of the American Foundation for the Blind, the AFB, just as a side note, a more conservative blind organization in the U.S. Many of my blind colleagues are members of the NFB, not the AFB. He launched a research program in 1930 in collaboration with RCA, Radio Corporation of America, which was then a very important, wealthy mainstream electronics manufacturer. I was surprised to see that they were collaborating with the American Foundation for the Blind. They collaborated in 1930 to produce talking books for blind readers. Surveys showed that only 10 to 20% of the blind population in the United States read Braille fluently at that time. And people who lost their sight later in life were unlikely to learn to read Braille. Also, only a minuscule proportion of the world's print material was even converted into Braille. This is why the need for talking books arose. Irwin's team ultimately produced what has been called the first commercial long-playing record, the first LP. It was a 12-inch disc that ran at the speed of 33 1/3 for 18 minutes. It was the first 33 1/3 that was commercial, compared to other commercial discs that ran for 11 minutes at 78 RPM. The talking book idea was quickly picked up by other national library and charity systems, starting with the Royal National Institute for the Blind in England, and then followed in 1954 by the Listening Library at the German Institute for the Blind in Marburg. Matthew Rubery, a scholar in the UK, has recently written the history of the talking book's dissemination, if you want more on that. Regarding the design of the first talking books, the sonic design, Irwin explained in a pamphlet for potential subscribers that he was anxious to make the fullest possible use of the talking book as a volume writ in sound. So he took inspiration from several popular recordings that reflect the multimedia nature of phonography and radio in this time period. At least in my world of sound studies, we often forget that radio and even phonograph listening often had visual components, just as silent film often had sonic components. So Irwin was inspired partly by a dramatic reading of Edgar Allan Poe's The Raven, accompanied by orchestral music, directed by Leopold Stokowski, a famous director in Philadelphia, and sold as a picture record. These picture records were a big trend in the 30s. The discs embellished with images and the text of the poem, as well as Stokowski's portrait, sort of pre-talking books. I can play a quick example of this for you. Let me see.
Distinctly I remember, it was in the bleak December, and each separate dying ember wrought its ghost upon the floor. Eagerly I wished the morrow, vainly I had sought to borrow from my...
Okay, so dramatic sound effects, really dramatic reading. This was what originally RCA and the AFB thought talking books would be. This is how this very dramatic sound design. The AFB built an entire library of incidental music and sound effects. They purchased a number of RCA Victor recordings for their sound library. They recruited stage and radio actors, a lot of the big names on Broadway and in New York radio at the time, for theatrical and dramatic narration. One of his assistants, Irwin's assistants, explained in a letter that these narrators were selected for their pleasing voices, their diction, and their interpretive skill. It turns out most blind readers, and especially students, completely ignored all of these meticulously orchestrated sound effects and instead tried to play their records at high speed. I, as a sighted reader, it never occurred to me that this would be true. At the start of my research, I have to say this caught me by surprise. I took a lot of delight in listening to the special effects and theatrical voices on these records. I wrote a grant to digitize the entire AFB collection of talking books. It cost several $1,000s. I convinced the National Science Foundation to give me this money because these were very important books with very important sound effects and very important famous actors doing the narration. That's all true, but it turns out none of the intended readers wanted any of that, and that's not how the books were written. You know, as a historian, you look at objects in the archive, but those objects don't always tell you how they were used. How do we learn about listening? How do we learn about how people read? It's very difficult. We have the objects, but it's often very difficult to figure out what was done with them. Jonathan and I will eventually make clips from this big digitized collection available on the website that we have that will accompany the book, but we'll have to put a big warning on it saying that these clips were not listened to in the way that maybe sighted readers would listen to them. Okay, so why listen at high speed? Again, according to Harvey Lauer, who I've interviewed, he's in his 80s now, he and the boys at the blind school wanted to get through their homework, of course, as quickly as possible. And then when they left the institution and went to universities, not all of them did, but some of them did, they had to keep up with sighted students. They had to be able to quickly skip forward and backward in books to do their homework assignments. Expert Braille readers achieved speeds of about 80 words a minute, but sighted readers read at 250 words a minute. Talking books could be read at 175 words per minute without speed up. So without speed up, they were faster, but of course, if you sped them up, you could approximate sighted reading. The emerging technique of oral speed reading was no doubt encouraged by the broader cultural imperative for visual speed reading in the same time period. Speed is one of the central tropes of industrialization. It's closely linked to efficiency, and a handful of media theorists and book historians have already examined the rhetorics and the apparatuses of visual speed reading that seemed to emerge around 1900. Nicholas Dames, who's an English professor at Columbia, has shown that psychophysics researchers in Germany and the US at the end of the 19th century began to positively correlate skimming to reading comprehension. I find this hard to believe, but because when I skim, I don't have very good comprehension and intelligence, but this was the paradigm, the faster the better in the early 20th century. And for visual speed reading, the faster the better, especially if there were no wasteful eye motions. So in letters to the AFB and the Library of Congress, around the same time, these early oral speed readers began asking for a new set of narration conventions. They wanted the narrators to change. They wanted to control the narrators' voices with an emphasis on what they called informative, unaffected, or neutral speech, insofar as speech could ever be neutral. And they thought that if the narrator spoke in a neutral way, it would facilitate high-speed playback with less distortion. And also, it would leave all interpretation to the blind reader. So in addition to hacking their playback machines, as I've already described, these readers were attempting to alter the sonic interface by controlling the tempo and the pitch fluctuations of the narrators, managing the pitch of high-speed playback by favoring even and lower-pitched voices at the production end. The lower the pitch of the initial voice, the more you could speed it up before it got too high-pitched to understand. Readers wrote into the American Foundation for the Blind with whole sets of their own guidelines about what and how to narrate. I'll give you, just from the archives there, these suggested rules for talking book recorders, again showing that disabled readers, blind readers, had a lot of lay expertise about the voice and about pacing and about sound production. This reader said in the 1930s, "Do not drop your voice in the last word of a sentence, or in the last syllable in words of more than 2 syllables, or in the case of parentheses or footnotes." So do not drop your voice at all while reading, which of course I've been doing this whole time. Do not indulge in dramatization or in trying to impersonate the persons in conversation. In 9 cases out of 10, it will be a failure. Again, remember that your only function is to read so that those who listen shall hear every word. A clear, even voice is the ideal. After all of these complaint letters, the Library of Congress and the AFB they actually did make this change. They incorporated this reader feedback into an instructional pamphlet for narrators called Recording Books for the Blind, which was reissued regularly from the 50s through the 70s, and it did produce a shift in narration style. First and foremost, the new narrators had clarity and naturalness of voice, which referred to lack of affectation. Over-preciseness of punctuation was to be avoided. Delivery was to be legato or connected as opposed to staccato. And narrators were even told to aim for the pace of 165 words per minute. They tried to get them to precisely pace themselves while they read, with pauses of 2 seconds inserted between distinct ideas. These constraints on the narrators would then make it easier to understand sped-up speech in the days before time stretching was available. So the most popular narrator's voice from the immediate post-war period, supposedly following these guidelines, although not perfectly, was Alexander Scourby. He recorded far more talking books in English than anyone else. I'll play for you this 1946 recording. Again, I would never call his voice neutral, and what a neutral voice is like extremely debatable. But you can tell right away that this recording differs from the Edgar Allan Poe example. There's a shift that's happened. Okay.
Mr. George L. Ravera director of the European office, has been in the United States conferring with the board and with other friends of the blind about the future plans of this organization. So, we've asked him, and also Dr. Robert B. Irwin, who's not only executive director of the American Foundation.
Kind of fast, actually, but no sound effects, relatively controlled volume, few drops at the ends of words or sentences, measured pauses, precise enunciation. Throughout these 4 decades, between the 30s and the 40s, those who wished to listen at fast rates continued to play their records on older machines, or they played 33 1/3 talking book records on 45 RPM mainstream machines, or they altered their record players. How do I know this when historical records of reading and listening practices are rarely found in the archive? Well, I was very lucky to have a reading assistant and a research assistant on this project, Shafika Hashhash, for 3 years. She's blind, and she was the president of the New Jersey Association of Blind Students and also a member of the NFB. And what I didn't realize was that the NFB maintains a database of most blind people in the United States, and many people can elect into their mailing and emailing list, and she suggested sending out a questionnaire about reading practices to the entire list, which she wrote and she sent out as an NFB member, which I wasn't. So she asked for older members who had actually used phonograph and tape playback machines. I mean, she's a born digital blind kid. That was not her. She asked them, were certain characteristics of voice or pacing important to you? And overwhelmingly, the responses we received to this question was yes. It wasn't just Harvey Lauer. Lots of people preferred narration for high-speed listening, and many, many, many blind people were listening at high speed before time stretching. Again, setting up a consumer demand, a demand for these high-speed playback techniques. This person who wrote to us said, "I've never paid much attention to the narrator. Just as I cannot tell you what font type was used in a book I read with my eyes." This person had formerly been sighted and then lost their vision. "I can't say much about the narrator. Normally, I speed up the pace of the playback. So back in the days of discs and tapes, the sound got somewhat distorted, and it was hard to tell who the narrator was. I speed up books." This is another interviewee. "I speed up books these days. Before that was easy to do. I liked more deliberate readers because I could understand them at double the speed," which was pretty easy to do in the early days as soon as 16 2/3 RPM recordings became available. I'll shorten all of these. This will help the translators catch up too. This is another one. "Pacing was important when most recordings were on disc, since you couldn't change the speed or you couldn't change it easily. When they went to cassette, you could change the speed, but the voice became that of chipmunks at the speed I liked to listen. Some of the readers should not have been allowed to read because their voices were unpleasant at regular speed and became comical at faster speeds." Lots of people talked about hacking into their machines also. This person said, "I learned I could speed up the tape by carefully setting the speed adjusting knob between the slow speed and the standard speed. The machine was not designed to do this, and eventually it broke because of my creative adjustments. Years later, variable speed became a feature of talking book equipment, so apparently I wasn't the only user who wanted it." And the final one, all through the archives, I found readers complaining about feminine voices, about women's voices or feminine sounding voices. And initially I thought this was just like sexism. It was just part of a broader social, I mean, you see this in early radio, and you also see this in early phonograph recording, critiques of feminine sounding voices. But in this particular case, it was less about ideas about authority and who was an appropriate narrator than it was simply about pitch. And so this surprised me also. These readers said, "I preferred male readers because you could speed them up with less of a chipmunk sort of thing." Of course, it doesn't have to be a male reader. It's just someone with a low-pitched voice. Okay. So the new protocols for talking book readers and the lay speed listening techniques that they facilitated set the stage for time compression in the era of magnetic tape. In other words, the argument I'm making is that the technique of oral speed reading precedes the technology of audio time compression. The practice precedes its automation. Blind readers soon became test subjects as well as a consumer market for the first commercial time-stretching machines, but they had already established oral speed reading as a listening technique. Moreover, they had made significant progress in altering the given conditions of playback, the hardware and the voice interface. Of course, in the bigger book that Jonathan and I are writing, we also look at experimental musicians altering the conditions of playback at the same time. We also look at physicists like Dennis Gabor. But for this chapter, we're focusing on this group. Tape-recorded talking books were introduced with the open reel format in 1959 and cassettes a decade later. By the 1960s, the AFB began partnering with engineers at Bell Laboratories, the world's largest research institution at the time, to exploit the tape format and build what they called a harmonic speech compressor. This gigantic machine never went into production, but it was cited by a wave of researchers who entered the time-stretching field in the 1970s. In the 1970s, of course, you have the integrated circuit and microelectronic, the boom of consumer electronics and microelectronics. That's why this wave of time-stretching happened in that decade. And one of those people was Francis Lee of MIT. Harvey Lauer had then become the technology transfer specialist at the VA. And lucky for me, he tested all of the commercial machines built in the US and Europe in the 70s, which employed compression strategies ranging from very simple but time-consuming tape splicing. There were literally devices that would cut and splice, or splice and reconnect tape, to much more complex but faster phase vocoding. Jonathan and I outline all the different techniques in this moment for time stretching. Lauer found most of them unsatisfactory. The research for this book involved a lot of work in his garage. He was a complete pack rat, which is a historian's dream. He saved all of not only the hardware of these early time-stretching devices, many of which were one of a kind, or if they were marketed, it was on a small scale. And he also saved all the tapes of the sounds coming off of those machines. Some of the machines don't work anymore. So I've digitized the demo tapes from many of these forgotten companies, Ambicron, Vocom, Whirling Dervish, and Jonathan and I will also put these sound files, these early prototypes for time stretching, in the online version of our book. This was really time consuming. Also, all of these boxes are labeled in Braille, but they're labeled in a Braille shorthand. Shafika, my research assistant, knows Braille, but she didn't understand this shorthand that Harvey, who's also blind, used. It took us, and he is older, so his tactile sensitivity is going away, so he could no longer read his own Braille. So it was we spent days and days and days and days and many research trips in his garage in a chain trying to decipher what was in each box so that I could type up in print what each thing was. And also so that we didn't steal any of his personal tapes, because he had tapes of his wife and his kids. I didn't want to digitize every single thing. It was a really hard process. Lauer considered Francis Lee's VeriSpeech machine to be the very best of the early models. And that might be because Lee really was interested genuinely in tools for blind readers at the outset of his career. In the 1960s, Lee had worked at the famous RLE, the Research Laboratory of Electronics at MIT, with lots of these famous cyberneticians and engineers at that time. And he was on a team building text-to-speech OCR reading machines for blind readers. When he transitioned into time compression of taped speech in the 70s, his publications universally described the VeriSpeech as a device designed for the aged and visually handicapped. And he was intimately familiar with their reading practices, having already worked on this OCR machine. He specifically, at first, intended the VeriSpeech to enable blind people, quote, to overcome the relatively slow reading rate by listening as compared to sight reading of printed material. The second drawback, he wrote in one of his publications, is that the speed of listening is paced completely by the recording. One can't skip or scan an audio recording, similar to scanning and skipping a printed text. Again, these extensive reading practices by sight were being transferred onto sound without much success at first. So after meeting Lee at this conference in Florida, Lauer and Lee agreed that Lauer would train 10 blinded veterans on one prototype in 1973. With only 7 hours of practice, they all could read with pretty good comprehension at 260 words per minute. So then the VA, the Veterans Administration, purchased a dozen units, or they gave Lee money to produce his first dozen units for veterans who were college students. A second VA study demonstrated that 86% of blinded veterans could comprehend material compressed to 475 words per minute, so far exceeding any other style of reading. By 1978, Lauer was so involved with Verispeech production that he wrote the owner's manual. So this blind test subject actually wrote the owner's manual for the Verispeech 2. Nonetheless, when the Wollensack brand tape recorder that played the 4-track talking books that the Verispeech connected to was updated at the end of the 1970s, Lee and his company Lexicon didn't bother to update the Verispeech attachment, meaning that blind people couldn't use it anymore. The test subjects were excluded from the commercial technology. Instead, Lexicon turned to making higher quality time compressors for radio, television, and other more profitable commercial uses, and blind readers were left without a workable time-stretching device. The Verispeech soon transformed radio listening for mainstream audiences, albeit in a very moderately perceptible manner. Time compression became standard for fitting long advertisements into shorter slots. In 1978, a psychology study conducted at the NYU Business School found that slightly raising the speed of a radio show or a radio program raised interest and comprehension. It was a better way also to sell more products by ear on radio. The technology was also employed to temporarily adjust films that were going to be screened on TV without changing the pitch of the soundtracks. This procedure was called lexiconing after Lee's company. It was a really highly controversial editing practice in the late 1980s. Filmmakers tried to sue Lexicon, similar to the colorization lawsuits, saying that you can't colorize a black and white film without the permission of the filmmaker. Filmmakers said you can't speed up even by 2% my film without my permission. That was a copyright issue. They lost, and actually speeding up films that are converted for television is completely routinely applied now to the soundtrack of rate-increased video. On lots of American TV, you'll see a sign that tells you that the film or TV program has been edited for time, so you're warned. But the person the producer of the original piece of content doesn't have control over the speed of their content anymore. And I guess is speed a property? Is it an authorial property or not? 2 years ago, it was widely reported in the popular press because of an avid Seinfeld YouTube viewer that cable channels in the U.S. are now speeding up movies and TV shows that are shown as reruns by 9% to make room for more commercials. And this very avid Seinfeld viewer found an original copy of a Seinfeld show and then compared it to a cable, a streamed version from 2 years ago, and you can see in this demo that it sped up. And this one didn't have the time compressed warning at the top. And people were angry because they don't want to have to watch more ads. This is an irony because originally time compression was used to speed up the ads. Now it's being used to speed up the content to give more time for more ads.
Call every day for the past 4 days. She hasn't returned one call.
Was it a scratch? Or a pick? Or a pick?
It was a scratch. It was a scratch.
It's me. It's me.
Don't you think I know the difference between a pick and a scratch? Yeah. Come on up. Yeah.
What is that?
So blind readers were using time compression to speed things up very perceptibly, to speed things way, way, way up. In commercial audio, for instance, TV or even ads, it was supposed to be imperceptible speed up, imperceptible on the part of the consumer, but it wasn't always imperceptible. And there's a third group of users, commercial artists, who wanted distortion. They didn't want this imperceptible kind of time compression. You can also use the tool for distortion. So commercial time compressors were very quickly appropriated by sound artists and computer music composers to give new sounds and noticeable sound processing. A very early example is the work of David Hikes. I was trying to figure out it's always hard to find the first person, but I was trying to figure out who was one of the early sound artists who got the lexicon in particular from Lee or from the blind community. And this one person I found was David Hikes. He lives in France now, and he's now known for his overtone singing and for producing haunting soundtracks in films like Tree of Life. He actually visited a place called the Center for Rate-Controlled Reading, run by a blind psychologist at the University of Louisville in 1973, and it was a place that was training blind people to read with the lexicon VeriSpeech. The center was the national hub in the 70s for information about time compressors. Hikes was an undergrad at Antioch, and he was studying experimental film with Tony Conrad and Paul Sheretz. After he visited this blind center, he bought a VeriSpeech, and he began recording 8-track tapes and art film soundtracks with the voices and other sounds distorted. And I think he was really the first person I found who directly took the technology from blind speed reading into the art world. I'll play this little example for you. It's from a video called Moving Parts. I don't think it's a very great video or an exciting example of time compression, but it was shown at the Whitney Museum in 1974. And Hikes claims, actually, I'll get to that in 1 second. Let me just play this for you first.
I'm very sorry, I can't see nor hear you. Turn the lights off. Oh, is it in here?
Here he's playing with the pitch shifting part of the VeriSpeech.
This work is to be called Moving Parts. The voice to Nina Langall. The work in its entirety was made by David Hikes. This was a curious room. The floor has a round pane of glass. This part has been done in the dark.
I'll stop there. So it was fascinating to me that there was a conversation between the world of the sort of high art world of sound art in New York and blind education in Kentucky in the U.S. in this time period. Hikes claims, and I take this claim with a grain of salt, that there may be a bit of like sexism or personal bitterness here, but he claims that his good friend Laurie Anderson was inspired by this film and his work with this time compressor from the blind school to take up similar electronic tools that launched her career. I have not asked her about this, and I don't know if she would agree, but this is his claim. So these experiments with time compression became much more common in the 1980s. If you look at the annual reports of places like EarCam in the 1980s, and I don't need to tell all of you, an important electroacoustic art center in Paris, their annual reports in the 80s describe the lexicon and other time compression manufacturers as precipitating one of the richest richest decades of musical production in their history. Trevor Wishart performed his Vox 5 at EarCam in the 80s. It's now considered one of the canonical early time-stretching pieces. In this, he compresses and expands the human voice to match the temporal pattern of bells, bees, and other phenomena. I think in the interest of time, I won't play this clip for you. It's readily available online. Only much later than the 80s, of course, did time stretching and pitch shifting become mainstream production techniques. We had to await the beginnings of cheap audio editing software for that. But if you ask the internet, like if you Google this question, who invented time stretching, the most frequent response that turns up is Goldie, an English DJ and producer. Goldie became famous in the 1990s for what he calls joyriding. I love this word for working with technology. He joyrode a 1980s era Eventide harmonizer, and Jonathan is writing about the Eventide harmonizer for the end of our book, to extend its existing time stretching function into a seemingly radical new sound effect for electronic music. Although, of course, as and Jonathan and I both are showing in our book, Goldie did not invent time stretching. There were engineers before him who did it. There were artists before him who did it. There were blind people before him who did it. But this is right now what the internet thinks. Joyriding is distinct from hacking because in joyriding, the hardware isn't changed. You're just extending the affordances of something. The popular myth of Goldie inventing time stretching raises the question of why artistic appropriation, making full use of affordances, seems so heroic to us, and why exploiting affordances often counts for more in the history of electroacoustics than does the labor of counter-engineering, the labor of test subjects, for instance, that might precede something like joyriding by many decades. All right, so to conclude, the broad reach of and applicability of time stretching, and I've only barely given you examples of this broad reach, was definitely not predicted by either the researchers or the engineers in my story. Like, this is not a teleological narrative. None of these people in the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s had any idea that, like, the soundscape would be so transformed, both perceptibly and, I would argue, more often imperceptibly by time stretching. In fact, the objective of blind readers, the explicit objective to speed listen without distortion, was continuously hindered and deferred in this story. These blind readers inspired projects like the Vera speech, and they served as test subjects, and they even wrote the first user manuals, but then their reading machines were commercially abandoned as other arenas became more profitable. This is a very common mode of appropriation by engineers of labor and knowledge from the disability community that I've written about in other articles as an assistive pretext. Pretext is a word with two meanings. Disability and assistance serves as both a precursor and as a pretense, a fake interest ultimately, a justification for research funding, or the test market for a technology that is ultimately directed elsewhere. This is very common in US engineering. Start something, get research funding by saying the tool you're devising is to help people with disabilities, and then once you have the prototype working, actually market it for more profitable markets. It was only the availability of synthetic text-to-speech interfaces in the 1990s, in other words, rate control at the production stage, not the playback stage. This is not time stretching anymore, that made speed reading by ear possible for blind readers. And in fact, this kind of reading is the norm for a new generation of blind readers in the US. And my student Shafika, who uses a screen reader on her phone called JAWS, but you could actually do this without a fancy screen reader, gave this demo of how she reads. Again, she barely ever uses time stretching anymore. She just uses synthetic speech.
This is JAWS operating at 60% speed.
Heading level 2, beyond the interest groups, there is the associational practices of labor. Heading level 2, capital, if one compares associations of business firms with labor unions solely with respect to properties of foreign organization, there seems to be, at first glance, a number of similarities. These are normally used to define the concept of interest groups, of which both types of organizations are. Page 72. Then said to be some cases, for instance, in these kinds of organizations, we find voluntary membership, a more or less bureaucratic structure.
So I think she said that was 60% speed. She actually uses JAWS at 83% speed. And when she took classes with me, she was always the first one to finish her reading because she could read by ear much more quickly than my sighted students could read by sight. She had to train herself to do this. There's no magical power that someone blind has to listen at high speed. And in fact, many sighted people who I've given talks to have said that they've trained themselves to listen at high speed now too. Maybe some of you here do that. I gave a talk at Johns Hopkins about this, and a lot of the medical students there were saying that they listen at high speed both because they have so much reading to do, but they also are often dissecting or doing something with their hands and have to listen to instructions recorded instructions in order to complete a task, and they've trained themselves to listen at high speed. So anyone can do this, but it takes a lot of practice. I can't even distinguish the words. At 60%, I can't tell where one word begins and one ends. But this is now, after all that work on time stretching, most blind people barely ever used it or use it today. So finally, mainstream platforms for audiobooks. Again, read Matt Rubery if you want to find out how audiobooks came out of the talking book world after World War II. These mainstream platforms allow digital audiobooks to be played at variable speed by blind and sighted readers alike, again, without any change to pitch. This has created a sort of lots of sensation in the popular media. The Atlantic, for instance, ran a piece in 2015 on the rise of speed listening, which they called an evil Silicon Valley phenomenon. They were warning their presumably East Coast U.S. readers that time compression is, quote, the way Silicon Valley has chosen to consume books and audiobooks because people there want to download the information into their brains as quickly as possible. It suggests that a book exists not primarily for pleasure, but rather for being sucked of its precious information as efficiently as possible. Rather than capitulate to these fears of impending sensory overload, or suggest that speed is always about efficiency and not also about pleasure and distortion and making new things, we might instead conclude that oral speed reading has not only encouraged the development of new technology, but the behavior itself is graduating from a minor listening technique to a much more widespread cultural technique. Thanks. And thank you so much to the translators. I'm sorry that I was not as easy to control in my pace. Should I take questions?
Yeah. We have room for some questions. Thank you very much for a wonderful talk.
And again, this eventually will be part of this collaboration with Jonathan Stern called Tuning Time.
No? Yeah. It's fascinating. I've got loads of questions for you.
Sure.
Just maybe think about concepts like queer time and crip time.
Oh, yeah.
And talking to lots of blind people about their experience of time. Is there some kind of cultural feedback through the use of technology whereby people using speed reading might start to experience time in a different way? Is there what's the wider you kind of touched on at the end, but what's the wider cultural future significance of this technology will have on all of us?
So those are good questions. I basically avoid the cognitive psychology. I love the question about queer time and crip time, and I would say that part of the question is almost the opposite of the question about what would psychologists say about how reading at high speed is changing the mind, because queer time and crip time are totally not about. They're totally de-essentialized. And I've thought about queer time and crip time. Jonathan actually wants to put some queer time readings into this book, and I am hesitant to because I'm not. I feel like the crip time readings might be better. And then we've so far totally avoided any data from cognitive psychology about what speed listening means. But if you know of any that you think would be useful, that tell me and I'll consider it.
No, I don't. I mean, I'm more interested in the social significance, the crip time and queer time.
So usually the way crip time has been written about is about slowed time. And this talk I'm giving is a bit at odds with most of the crip time literature because a lot of it is about dropping out, tuning out, not doing your work, not being able to work, not resisting rationalization, resisting efficiency, either intentionally or because you're a misfit. Amy Hamri is a writer on design and disability who has a great book that just came out from Minnesota. Oh, God, what is their book called? I'm going to forget the title. But they make the point about this word misfit in English being both a word for people who are stigmatized. It's kind of it might be a synonym even for someone who's like queer, who doesn't fit in, but it's also like not, it literally means not fitting into society. And they make the point that these misfits are generated by ergonomics and engineering in the 20th century. And I think with Crip Time, it's often about not fitting. This story is about people trying to get their work done and trying to fit in, and even like at the end, trying to read faster than anyone else. I still think it's worth theorizing Crip Time, and it's worth going back through and like saying, here's how Crip Time is understood, and here's all these other stories of cripping time, because actually not every single reader, of course, was just a super speed reader. There were many examples that I didn't give you in this paper, which will be in the chapter, about blind readers actually slowing stuff down dramatically, often to try to understand a name that's being spoken, or when learning another language, or when listening to like difficult scientific and mathematical texts. So there's a lot of slowdown that also happens. That's just not part of this talk, and the slowdown fits, to use the word, keep using the word fit, better with the Crip Time argument.
So are you saying they'll use the same, some of the people you talk to, respondents, will use
Yes.
the same tools to slow down?
Yes.
So it's just about having control over
Control.
time. But there's control over time, isn't there, an experience
Yes.
of time within that?
Yeah. I mean, the demand was predominantly for speed up, just because you're being forced to read a huge quantity of material to survive in the school system. Okay. But skimming and skipping and searching, I also am not giving you a very elaborate explanation of how skimming, skipping, and searching work with oral reading, but it requires both speed up and slow down. It also required a very complicated audio indexing, tracking set of technologies that developed over many years with tape. So I really like this question. I want to work with Crip Time in this project. Jonathan is trying to figure out which of the queer time authors might be good. And we're sort of debating about, I mean, there's a certain amount of theory that we can squeeze in. I'm wondering what you think about which of the queer time authors.
Well, I'm thinking more of Crip Time. I'm thinking of Claire Cunningham, the dancer, for example, who, part of her work is to get away from fetishizing the fact that she's got no legs, and it's to bring the audience into an experience of another time. Not her time, but just an experience of another time. I guess what interests me about this as a kind of methodology or a way of thinking is that it seems that there's a really powerful tool for people to experience time differently, and it's and you're right, we're not just being spoken at, we're controlling the voice, and I guess in the time where we're getting used to voice automation being talked to, this is a fascinating way in which we can maybe control the speed at which we're talked to, which I hadn't thought about before.
And I guess with Crip Time, there's often a lack of control, like surrendering oneself to dependency, care, interdependence, and a lack of individual agency and control, and that's something else. And you can look at the work of like artists Park MacArthur, Constantina Zavetsanos, who do a lot. They've written articles called like Crip Time Sleep, done art projects called like Crip Time Sleepy Time, and they host all these slumber parties that are about dropping out and sleeping and resting and care and dependence rather than like work. So I think the other piece to make this a real Crip Time argument would also be to show moments where control, like individual agency and control, aren't necessary. The queer time stuff, a lot of it comes out of queer historiography work about relations between present-day queer people and queer scholars and their relationship to the past. And a lot of that mode of temporal thinking, I don't find that useful for this particular project. But again, this is in progress, and and Jonathan and I are, like, when you co-author with someone, you're like hashing out what you think, like what theories you want to use, and this has been something we've been debating.
That's great. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your talk. I'm curious, I don't know if it's part of that, but when blind people, when they are listening, how do they make notes? I imagine it's by speaking. And I wonder about this relationship about listening and speaking and speed. And then when they re-listen their notes, how does it work with the speed? Do you have any...
Yeah, I mean, for today, many of Shafika and Harvey, many of the blind students and adults who I've talked to use many different technologies for reading and many different technologies for writing, just as anyone does, because there's so many tools out there for everyone to use. So, Shafika, in terms of reading, she describes to me that she'll do speed reading with the text-to-speech for most of her schoolwork. Occasionally, for something like a novel, she'll still listen to a recorded book. But then she definitely prefers Braille for science and math texts because Braille is spatialized the same way that other kinds of print are, and it makes it easier to understand certain kinds of formulas and graphs. There's also all sorts of raised print, like raised line tools for graphics. And then for writing, similarly, she types on a computer and listens back in synthetic speech, or she uses a brailler. There's digital braillers that will produce tactile output in print form, or her computer has not only typical alphabetic keys, but Braille, a refreshable Braille display. So it's like a flat pad that has raises and lowers with Braille letters as the screen changes. So, but I haven't seen Shafika record herself, but that's not to say that other people wouldn't have. And certainly before the digital moment, people would have had to do that. There was also co-writing. I mean, you'd have to be in a wealthy elite to do this, but someone like Helen Keller had an assistant who often wrote for her, either in Braille or in just handwriting or typed. So there's lots of examples where humans are reading and writing together. And I'm giving you a story of individual agency here, and I realized, I'm so glad you set me off with this first question. There are so many other stories of things like co-reading throughout this project and throughout any story of blind reading where people read together, and that's exactly what Shafika and I had to do in our research. It cannot be done by an individual. I don't read Braille, Shafika doesn't read ink print, all of our archives are a mix of both. So not everything is about just individuals and freedom and independence. There's lots of ways people read and write together.
Thank you for a great talk.
Thanks, David.
I was wondering if you could say more about the issues of power that you alluded to that are involved in the normatizing certain voices and the exclusion of certain affective properties.
Yeah. Well, Matt has a chapter on general talking book recording in the US and the UK, and about the kinds of voices that were excluded and the kinds of things that were considered accents. Of course, everyone has an accent. Things that were considered accents at all and things that were considered desirable or undesirable accents. Again, it changes decade by decade and depending on what country you're looking at. Gender, accent, race. If you know Nina Eidsheimer's work on racialized voices, that also came into play with the recording of mainstream books. And it's very easy to get at this history because these books tended to be funded by national organizations in each country. There were also always like cassette tape collectives and volunteer narrators doing other things, but because like in the US and in the UK, there were big national charities or national libraries doing this production, their archives give you a very clear sense of what kinds of voices were considered neutral or were considered acceptable in a given decade. So I'm not being specific because it would differ depending on when one is looking at it. But if you go through the AFB archives during the civil rights era, there's a huge outcry among readers, tons of complaint letters about the voices being too normative. Like, why aren't there more voices that sound black reading black literature? Again, what does it mean to have a black voice? Read Nina Eidsheimer's book on this. Why aren't there more female voices, but why isn't there any feminist literature in the Library of Congress collection? A whole activist group called the Women's Braille Press was founded in the 70s to get volunteer feminist lesbian narrators to read their own books on cassette tapes because the Library of Congress wouldn't put lesbian literature in their collection. I mean, I could give you a million anecdotes on this. I mean, there's so many examples of like what got recorded and who got to say it, and lots of examples of these activist blind groups cropping up to fix what they saw as the problem of what was missing sonically and content-wise. Does that answer your question? I don't think I'm answering it in terms of speed, though, but...
No, that's helpful. Thanks.
Okay.
Hi. First of all, I want to thank you.
Thanks.
Because it was really interesting. I don't know if I have a question, but maybe it's more a comment related to what she asked and what you said about your assistant choosing like fast speed reading, listening reading for narrative or for what we could think about linear
yes.
or discourse or like stories or in the time flow way, distinctive to reading something as science or maybe an essay that you need to go back in time.
Yeah.
Sometimes when you read, I thought that Braille has an spatial quality that talking books or audio books doesn't have because of recording. I don't know if that is something for you.
Well, I mean, so yes, the Braille is very easy to navigate in a readerly way because it's organized, it's print, just like ink print. And so if what is being read is a book, typically understood, printed books are very easily ink. So in the blind world, nothing is just print. It always has a prefix. Print. What I, as a sighted person who think of print, would be called ink print, just to qualify that it's something that sighted people look at. And then there's also embossed print for things like Braille, or raised print. It's very easy to translate a book from one kind of print to another, and the navigation is the same. The page is a wonderful way to navigate footnotes and index. It's much harder than to take this format that came about because of print and turn it into something sonic. Is very difficult. And there's a whole array of really interesting tape recording techniques that were developed in the 70s for bookmarking. How do you bookmark via sound? And for indexing. I mean, I haven't written on this. I've read through it in the archives. I don't know of anyone who's written on it. I actually have in my office a bunch of weird appliances for sonic bookmarking that I've come across, like in Harvey's Garage, where you would push down on a button while you were listening to something, and then if you fell asleep while listening and released the pressure, it would stop right there. How do you, that was sort of a basic one. But it's absolutely true that Braille matches up to ink print just because it's a print technology. The problem is a lot of things are not ever transferred to Braille. So there's a lot of things that one needs to read that are never Brailled. That's why all these other technologies have had to arise. There's still a problem for lots of blind people with ephemeral print, and frankly, most of the print material we come across in our daily lives is just environmental and ephemeral print. Like, if it's on the computer, yes, you can turn it into text-to-speech. But, like, what do you do with your mail, with stuff on the walls, with signs outside? Most of what one needs to read is still not readable. And even with, like, the Kurzweil and other kinds of apps on your phone that take screenshots and convert that text-to-speech, they don't work that well. And if you're blind, you have to know where to point your phone. That's one of the biggest problems. Shafika has all of these apps on her phone. She's a born digital kid from a well-off family, and so she has all of this technology. But, she opened her purse for me and was like, how do I figure out what it says on my prescription, which prescription bottle I'm looking at? How do I figure out if this is shampoo or conditioner? The bottles feel exactly the same. It's just the print. But how do I know where the surface is curved? Doesn't work well with a camera phone to capture that. how do you know where to put it? So there's just a lot of problems still with ephemeral and environmental print. And the story I'm telling here is like about books, but as you all know, books are only one thing that we read. There's lots of other stuff that needs to be turned into tactile or sound. And there's so many other things that I'm not even mentioning here. I've written about some of them online, all sorts of technologies for vibrating, tactile vibrations as a code that one can decipher. Musical print, I've written a lot about. Turning of text into musical tones that some blind readers learn to decipher. Harvey read by musical print also. There's so many different ways that reading can be done. I often say this too. Apparently we live in a world of so much multimedia, and so many people in the world have access, over 90% of people in the world now have, they don't necessarily own, but have access to a mobile phone and to digital media for that reason, and yet we don't actually have elaborated new semiotic systems. I'm not sure if this is making sense, but when I interviewed Harvey and I realized that he had like 3 different forms of musical print that he could decipher and all these vibrations that he could decipher. He had many, many semiotic systems attached to electronic sound and electronic vibration. And I thought, what an impoverished world I actually live in, because I'm using my same semiotic systems. Yes, I'm looking at lots of new blinking lights and hearing lots of new sounds, but I'm applying my old modes of decoding to them.
Hi, thanks for a really interesting talk. I just wanted to ask, essentially, if oral speed reading, if there's a kind of version of it, or does it make sense to talk about a version of it prior to recording technology? And I'm sort of thinking, since the argument seems to rely on the fact that these oral speed reading practices precede the time-stretching technology that you see in Pro Tools and whatnot today, that would it make sense to talk about this practice even prior to the invention of the phonograph? I've thought about this. You tell me. Well, I mean, I'm thinking of, for example, the mensuration canons of Renaissance music. So one voice, singing a passage very slowly, that might be half the speed or 1/3 of the speed of another voice, and then yet another voice that's twice the speed. And then in some instances, of course, there are pitch
I can tell you I had not thought about this, so I'm writing it down.
Well, I guess part of the question then becomes sort of what would these kind of contemporary time-stretching algorithms look like if they had less of the kind of musical, technological inheritance and maybe more of the speed reading as their kind of genealogy, as it were. But I guess just since it seems to be such a kind of central sort of part of the question, then is there some kind of, maybe concrete poetry could provide another kind of entry into that?
I mean, I love the way you're asking the question, and for anyone who's follows the sort of all the new waves in German media theory, I do really love this Kulturtechnik. Bernhard Siegert and his students trend that's happening right now, which is looking for very long duration techniques, human behaviors, and the ways they get concretized into technology. And it tends to be much. He writes about things like gates. Humans creating gates, and this feeding into the logic gate, like thousands of years of history behind logic gates and computers. Obviously, this is like a 100-year history. It's nothing like that. And you're pointing out it could be drawn out longer. The thing, of course, many, many people who are book historians will always point out that the visual reading by a lone reader with a text is not the way most people read now and not the way most people have ever read. In most of the history of reading, someone reads out, there's readers who read out loud to others. And this is true in religious contexts, it's true in school contexts, it's true in the home with children. Reading is often oral. Even if it seems to like academics to have this myth of the lone individual cited visual kind of reading, which did arise as one mode of reading, in the late 19th century with compulsory education and things like that. But the speed of the production of sound. I mean, Jonathan and I have thought about things like auctioneers, like who were fast talkers? Were there people who were really, really good at producing fast speech? Before the phonograph, auctioneers was one, but were the listeners to that able to? They weren't. Yeah, but they were. It wasn't really the listeners weren't able to have any element of control, and I wouldn't necessarily call it reading. I mean, I'm making a very fine distinction between just listening to speech and oral speed reading. Most blind people say they're reading when they listen to speech, but they wouldn't say that when they listen to talking books or text to speech coming out of print, because they're doing readerly behaviors of skimming, moving. I mean, they're reading that. Whereas listening to me, they're not exerting any control over what I'm saying usually. But I wrote this down, and I'm going to think about it, because the slowing down part especially, that seems interesting to me. I have no idea what time it is, so tell me if I'm going on too long.
I think we can have one more question.
We have time for one more?
Anybody? So I think that's it.
Thanks.
Thank you, Mara.
Perfect. Thank you.
Thank you.